Chapter 17. The Walled City. Dropping to the ground once more, he picked up the trail of the girl and her captors, which he followed easily along what appeared to be a well-beaten trail. It was not long before he came to a small stream, where he quenched his thirst, and thereafter he saw that the trail followed in the general direction of the stream, which ran southwesterly. Here and there were cross-trails and others which joined the main avenue, and always upon each of them were the tracks and scent of the great cats of Numa, the lion, and Sheeta, the panther. With the exception of a few small rodents, there appeared to be no other wildlife on the surface of the valley. There was no indication of Bara, the deer, or Horta, the boar, of Gorgo, the buffalo, Buto, Tantor, or Duro. Hista, the snake, was there. He saw him in the trees in greater numbers than he ever had seen Hista before, and once beside a reedy pool he caught a scent that could have belonged to none other than Gimla the crocodile. But upon none of these did the Tarmangani care to feed. And so as he craved meat, he turned his attention to the birds above him. His assailants of the night before had not disarmed him. Either in the darkness and the rush of the charging lions the human foe had overlooked him, or else they had considered him dead, but whatever the reason, he still retained his weapons, his spear and his long knife, his bow and arrows, and his grass rope. Fitting a shaft to his bow, Tarzan awaited an opportunity to bring down one of the larger birds, and when the opportunity finally presented itself, he drove the arrow straight to its mark. As the gaily plumaged creature fluttered to earth, its companions and the little monkeys set up a most terrific chorus of wails and screaming protests. The whole forest became suddenly a babel of hoarse screams and shrill shrieks. Tarzan would not have been surprised had one or two birds in the immediate vicinity given voice to terror as they fled, but that the whole life of the jungle should set up so weird a protest filled him with disgust. It was an angry face that he turned up toward the monkeys and the birds as there suddenly stirred within him a savage inclination to voice his displeasure and his answer to what he considered their challenge. And so it was that there broke upon this jungle for the first time Tarzan's hideous scream of victory and challenge. The effect upon the creatures above him was instantaneous. Where before the air had trembled to the din of their voices, now utter silence reigned, and a moment later the ape-man was alone with his puny kill. The silence following so closely the previous tumult carried a sinister impression to the ape-man, which still further aroused his anger. Picking the bird from where it had fallen, he withdrew his arrow from the body and returned it to his quiver. Then with his knife he quickly and deftly removed the skin and feathers together. He ate angrily, growling as though actually menaced by a nearby foe, and perhaps too his growls were partially induced by the fact that he did not care for the flesh of birds. Better this, however, than nothing, and from what his senses had told him there was no flesh in the vicinity such as he was accustomed to and cared most for. How he would have enjoyed a juicy haunch from Paco, the zebra, or a steak from the loin of Gorgo, the buffalo. The very thought made his mouth water and increased his resentment against this unnatural forest that harbored no such delicious quarry. He had but partially consumed his kill when he suddenly became aware of a movement in the brush at no great distance from him and downwind, and a moment later his nostrils picked up the scent of Numa from the opposite direction. And then upon either side he caught the fall of padded feet and the brushing of bodies against leafy branches. The ape-man smiled. What stupid creature did they think him to be surprised by such clumsy stalkers? Gradually the sounds and scents indicated that lions were moving upon him from all directions, that he was in the center of a steadily converging circle of beasts. Evidently they were so sure of their prey that they were making no effort toward stealth, for he heard twigs crack beneath their feet, and the brushing of their bodies against the vegetation through which they forced their way. He wondered what could have brought them. It seemed unreasonable to believe that the cries of the birds and the monkeys should have summoned them, and yet, if not, it was indeed a remarkable coincidence. His judgment told him that the death of a single bird in this forest which teemed with birds could scarce be of sufficient moment to warrant that which followed. Yet even in the face of reason and past experience he found that the whole affair perplexed him. He stood in the center of the trail awaiting the coming of the lions and wondering what would be the method of their attack, or if they would indeed attack. Presently a manned lion came into view along the trail below him. At sight of him the lion halted. The beast was similar to those that had attacked him earlier in the day, a trifle larger and a trifle darker than the lions of his native jungles, but neither so large nor so black as Numa of the pit. Presently he distinguished the outlines of other lions in the surrounding brush and among the trees. Each of them halted as it came within sight of the ape-man, and there they stood regarding him in silence. Tarzan wondered how long it would be before they charged, and while he waited he resumed his feeding, though with every sense constantly alert, One by one the lions lay down, but always their faces were toward him and their eyes upon him. There had been no growling and no roaring, just the quiet drawing of the silent circle about him. It was all so entirely foreign to anything that Tarzan ever before had seen lions do that it irritated him so that presently, having finished his repast, he fell to making insulting remarks to first one and then another of the lions, after the habit he had learned from the apes of his childhood. Dango, eater of carrion, he called them, and he compared them most unfavorably with Hista, the snake, the most loathed and repulsive creature of the jungle. Finally he threw handfuls of earth at them and bits of broken twigs, and then the lions growled and bared their fangs, but none of them advanced. Cowards, Tarzan taunted them. Numa with a heart of Bara, the deer, he told them who he was, and after the manner of the jungle folk he boasted as to the horrible things he would do to them, but the lions only lay and watched him. It must have been a half hour after their coming that Tarzan caught in the distance along the trail the sound of footsteps approaching. They were the footsteps of a creature who walked upon two legs, and though Tarzan could catch no scent spoor from that direction, he knew that a man was approaching. Nor had he long to wait before his judgment was confirmed by the appearance of a man who halted in the trail directly behind the first lion that Tarzan had seen. At sight of the newcomer, the ape-man realized that here was one similar to those who had given off the unfamiliar scent spoor that he had detected the previous night, and he saw that not only in the matter of scent did the man differ from other human beings with whom Tarzan was familiar. The fellow was strongly built with skin of a leathery appearance like parchment yellowed with age. His hair, which was coal-black and 3 or 4 inches in length, grew out stiffly at right angles to his scalp. His eyes were close set and the irises densely black and very small, so that the white of the eyeball showed around them. The man's face was smooth except for a few straggly hairs on his chin and upper lip. The nose was aquiline and fine, but the hair grew so far down on the forehead as to suggest a very low and brutal type. The upper lip was short and fine, while the lower lip was rather heavy and inclined to be pendulous, the chin being equally weak. Altogether, the face carried the suggestion of a once strong and handsome countenance entirely altered by physical violence or by degraded habits and thoughts. The man's arms were long, though not abnormally so, while his legs were short, though straight. He was clothed in tight-fitting nether garments and a loose, sleeveless tunic that fell just below his hips, while his feet were shod in soft-soled sandals, the wrappings of which extended halfway to his knees, closely resembling a modern spiral military legging. He carried a short, heavy spear, and at his side swung a weapon that at first so astonished the ape-man that he could scarcely believe the evidence of his senses, a heavy saber in a leather-covered scabbard. The man's tunic appeared to have been fabricated upon a loom. It was certainly not made of skins, while the garments that covered his legs were quite as evidently made from the hides of rodents. Tarzan noted the utter unconcern with which the man approached the lions, and the equal indifference of Numa to him. The fellow paused for a moment as though appraising the ape-man, and then pushed on past the lions, brushing against the tawny hide as he passed him in the trail. About 20 feet from Tarzan the man stopped, addressing the former in a strange jargon, no syllable of which was intelligible to the Tarmangani. His gestures indicated numerous references to the lions surrounding them, and once he touched his spear with the forefinger of his left hand, and twice he struck the saber at his hip. While he spoke, Tarzan studied the fellow closely, with the result that there fastened itself upon his mind a strange conviction that the man who addressed him was what might only be described as a rational maniac. As the thought came to the ape-man, he could not but smile, so paradoxical the description seemed. Yet a closer study of the man's features, carriage, and the contour of his head carried almost incontrovertibly the assurance that he was insane, while the tones of his voice and his gestures resembled those of a sane and intelligent mortal. Presently the man had concluded his speech, and appeared to be waiting questioningly Tarzan's reply. The ape-man spoke to the other first in the language of the great apes, but he soon saw that the words carried no conviction to his listener. Then, with equal futility, he tried several native dialects, but to none of these did the man respond. By this time Tarzan began to lose patience. He had wasted sufficient time by the road, and as he had never depended much upon speech in the accomplishment of his ends, he now raised his spear and advanced toward the other. This, evidently, was a language common to both, for instantly the fellow raised his own weapon, and at the same time a low call broke from his lips, a call which instantly brought to action every lion in the hitherto silent circle. A volley of roars shattered the silence of the forest, and simultaneously lions sprang into view upon all sides as they closed in rapidly upon their quarry. The man who had called them stepped back, his teeth bared in a mirthless grin. It was then that Tarzan first noticed that the fellow's upper canines were unusually long and exceedingly sharp. It was just a flashing glimpse he got of them as he leaped agilely from the ground and, to the consternation of both the lions and their master, disappeared in the foliage of the lower terrace, flinging back over his shoulder as he swung rapidly away. "I am Tarzan of the Apes, mighty hunter, mighty fighter. None in the jungle more powerful, none more cunning than Tarzan." A short distance beyond the point at which they had surrounded him, Tarzan came to the trail again and sought for the spoor of Bertha Kircher and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick. He found them quickly and continued upon his search for the two. The spoor lay directly along the trail for another half-mile when the way suddenly debouched from the forest into open land, and there broke upon the astonished view of the ape-man the domes and minarets of a walled city. Directly before him in the wall nearest him, Tarzan saw a low-arched gateway to which a well-beaten trail led from that which he had been following. In the open space between the forest and the city walls, quantities of garden stuff was growing, while before him at his feet, in an open man-made ditch, ran a stream of water. The plants in the garden were laid out in well-spaced symmetrical rows and appeared to have been given excellent attention and cultivation. Tiny streams were trickling between the rows from the main ditch before him, and at some distance to his right, he could see people at work among the plants. The city wall appeared to be about 30 feet in height, its plastered expanse unbroken, except by occasional embrasures. Beyond the wall rose the domes of several structures, and numerous minarets dotted the skyline of the city. The largest and central dome appeared to be gilded, while others were red or blue or yellow. The architecture of the wall itself was of uncompromising simplicity. It was of a cream shade and appeared to be plastered and painted. At its base was a line of well-tended shrubs, and at some distance towards its eastern extremity it was vine-covered to the top. As he stood in the shadow of the trail, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the picture before him, he became aware of the approach of a party in his rear, and there was borne to him the scent of the man and the lions whom he had so readily escaped. Taking to the trees, Tarzan moved a short distance to the west, and finding a comfortable crotch at the edge of the forest where he could watch the trail leading through the gardens to the city gate, he awaited the return of his would-be captors. And soon they came, the strange man followed by the pack of great lions. Like dogs they moved along behind him down the trail among the gardens to the gate. Here the man struck upon the panels of the door with the butt of his spear, and when it opened in response to his signal, he passed in with his lions. Beyond the open door, Tarzan, from his distant perch, caught but a fleeting glimpse of life within the city, just enough to indicate that there were other human creatures who abode there, and then the door closed. Through that door he knew that the girl and the man whom he sought to succor had been taken into the city. What fate lay in store for them, or whether already it had been meted out to them, he could not even guess, nor where, within that forbidding wall, they were incarcerated, he could not know. But of one thing he was assured, that if he were to aid them, he could not do it from outside the wall. He must gain entrance to the city first, nor did he doubt that once within, his keen senses would eventually reveal the whereabouts of those whom he sought. The low sun was casting long shadows across the gardens when Tarzan saw the workers returning from the eastern field. A man came first, and as he came he lowered little gates along the large ditch of running water, shutting off the streams that had run between the rows of growing plants, and behind him came other men carrying burdens of fresh vegetables in great woven baskets upon their shoulders. Tarzan had not realized that there had been so many men working in the field, but now as he sat there at the close of the day, he saw a procession filing in from the east, bearing the tools and the produce back into the city. And then, to gain a better view, the ape-man ascended to the topmost branches of a tall tree where he overlooked the nearer wall. From this point of vantage he saw that the city was long and narrow, and that while the outer walls formed a perfect rectangle, the streets within were winding. Toward the center of the city there appeared to be a low white building around which the larger edifices of the city had been built, and here in the fast waning light, Tarzan thought that between two buildings he caught the glint of water, but of that he was not sure. His experience of the centers of civilization naturally inclined him to believe that this central area was a plaza about which the larger buildings were grouped, and that there would be the most logical place to search first for Bertha Kircher and her companion. And then the sun went down and darkness quickly enveloped the city, a darkness that was accentuated for the ape-man rather than relieved by the artificial lights which immediately appeared in many of the windows visible to him. Tarzan had noticed that the roofs of most of the buildings were flat, the few exceptions being those of what he imagined to be the more pretentious public structures. How this city had come to exist in this forgotten part of unexplored Africa, the ape-man could not conceive. Better than another, he realized something of the unsolved secrets of the great dark continent, enormous areas of which have as yet been untouched by the foot of civilized man. Yet he could scarce believe that a city of this size, and apparently thus well constructed, could have existed for the generations that it must have been there without intercourse with the outer world. Even though it was surrounded by a trackless desert waste, as he knew it to be, he could not conceive that generation after generation of men could be born and die there without attempting to solve the mysteries of the world beyond the confines of their little valley. And yet, here was the city surrounded by tilled land and filled with people. With the coming of night there arose throughout the jungle the cries of the great cats, the voice of Numa blended with that of Sheeta, and the thunderous roars of the great males reverberated through the forest until the earth trembled. And from within the city came the answering roars of other lions. A simple plan for gaining entrance to the city had occurred to Tarzan, and now that darkness had fallen, he set about to put it into effect. Its success hinged entirely upon the strength of the vines he had seen surmounting the wall toward the east. In this direction he made his way, while from out of the forest about him the cries of the flesh-eaters increased in volume and ferocity. 1/4 of a mile intervened between the forest and the city wall, 1/4 of a mile of cultivated land unrelieved by a single tree. Tarzan of the Apes realized his limitations, and so he knew that it would undoubtedly spell death for him to be caught in the open space by one of the great black lions of the forest if, as he had already surmised, Numa of the Pit was a specimen of the forest lion of the valley. He must therefore depend entirely upon his cunning and his speed, and upon the chance that the vine would sustain his weight. He moved through the middle terrace, where the way is always easiest, until he reached a point opposite the vine-clad portion of the wall, and there he waited, listening and scenting, until he might assure himself that there was no Numa within his immediate vicinity, or at least none that sought him. And when he was quite sure that there was no lion close by in the forest, and none in the clearing between himself and the wall, he dropped lightly to the ground and moved stealthily out into the open. The rising moon, just topping the eastern cliffs, cast its bright rays upon the long stretch of open garden beneath the wall, and too, it picked out in clear relief for any curious eyes that chanced to be cast in that direction, the figure of the giant ape-man moving across the clearing. It was only chance, of course, that a great lion hunting at the edge of the forest saw the figure of the man halfway between the forest and the wall. Suddenly there broke upon Tarzan's ears a menacing sound. It was not the roar of a hungry lion, but the roar of a lion in rage, and as he glanced back in the direction from which the sound came, he saw a huge beast moving out from the shadow of the forest toward him. Even in the moonlight, and at a distance, Tarzan saw that the lion was huge, that it was indeed another of the black man monsters similar to Numa of the Pit. For an instant he was impelled to turn and fight, but at the same time the thought of the helpless girl imprisoned in the city flashed through his brain, and without an instant's hesitation Tarzan of the Apes wheeled and ran for the wall. Then it was that Numa charged. Numa the lion can run swiftly for a short distance, but he lacks endurance. For the period of an ordinary charge he can cover the ground with greater rapidity possibly than any other creature in the world. Tarzan, on the other hand, could run at great speed for long distances, though never as rapidly as Numa when the latter charged. The question of his fate then rested upon whether with a start he could elude Numa for a few seconds, and if so, if the lion would then have sufficient stamina remaining to pursue him at a reduced gait for the balance of the distance to the wall. Never before, perhaps, was staged a more thrilling race, and yet it was run with only the moon and stars to see. Alone and in silence the two beasts sped across the moonlit clearing. Numa gained with appalling rapidity upon the fleeing man, yet at every bound Tarzan was nearer to the vine-clad wall. Once the ape-man glanced back, Numa was so close upon him that it seemed inevitable that at the next bound he should drag him down. So close was he that the ape-man drew his knife as he ran, that he might at least give a good account of himself in the last moments of his life. But Numa had reached the limit of his speed and endurance. Gradually he dropped behind, but he did not give up the pursuit, and now Tarzan realized how much hinged upon the strength of the untested vines. If, at the inception of the race, only Goro and the stars had looked down upon the contestants, such was not the case at its finish, since from an embrasure near the summit of the wall 2 close-set black eyes peered down upon the two. Tarzan was a dozen yards ahead of Numa when he reached the wall. There was no time to stop and institute a search for sturdy stems and safe handholds. His fate was in the hands of chance, and with the realization he gave a final spurt and, running cat-like up the side of the wall among the vines, sought with his hands for something that would sustain his weight. Below him Numa leaped also. Chapter 18. Among the Maniacs. As the lions swarmed over her protectors, Bertha Kircher shrank back in the cave in a momentary paralysis of fright superinduced perhaps by the long days of terrific nerve strain which she had undergone. Mingled with the roars of the lions had been the voices of men, and presently out of the confusion and turmoil she felt the near presence of a human being, and then hands reached forth and seized her. It was dark and she could see but little, nor any sign of the English officer or the ape-man. The man who seized her kept the lions from her with what appeared to be a stout spear, the haft of which he used to beat off the beasts. The fellow dragged her from the cavern the while he shouted what appeared to be commands and warnings to the lions. Once out upon the light sands of the bottom of the gorge, objects became more distinguishable, and then she saw that there were other men in the party, and that two half led and half carried the stumbling figure of a third, whom she guessed must be Smith Oldwick. For a time the lions made frenzied efforts to reach the two captives, but always the men with them succeeded in beating them off. The fellows seemed utterly unafraid of the great beasts leaping and snarling about them, handling them much the same as one might handle a pack of obstreperous dogs. Along the bed of the old watercourse that once ran through the gorge they made their way, and as the first faint lightening of the eastern horizon presaged the coming dawn, they paused for a moment upon the edge of a declivity, which appeared to the girl in the strange light of the waning night as a vast, bottomless pit. But as their captors resumed their way and the light of the new day became stronger, she saw that they were moving downward toward a dense forest. Once beneath the overarching trees all was again Cimmerian darkness, nor was the gloom relieved until the sun finally arose beyond the eastern cliffs, when she saw that they were following what appeared to be a broad and well-beaten game trail through a forest of great trees. The ground was unusually dry for an African forest, and the underbrush, while heavily foliaged, was not nearly so rank and impenetrable as that which she had been accustomed to find in similar woods. It was as though the trees and the bushes grew in a waterless country, nor was there the musty odor of decaying vegetation or the myriads of tiny insects such as are bred in damp places. As they proceeded and the sun rose higher, the voices of the arboreal jungle life rose in discordant notes and loud chattering about them. Innumerable monkeys scolded and screamed in the branches overhead, while harsh-voiced birds of brilliant plumage darted hither and thither. She noticed presently that their captors often cast apprehensive glances in the direction of the birds, and on numerous occasions seemed to be addressing the winged denizens of the forest. One incident made a marked impression on her. The man who immediately preceded her was a fellow of powerful build, yet when a brilliantly colored parrot swooped downward toward him, he dropped upon his knees and, covering his face with his arms, bent forward until his head touched the ground. Some of the others looked at him and laughed nervously. Presently the man glanced upward, and seeing that the bird had gone, rose to his feet and continued along the trail. It was at this brief halt that Smith Oldwick was brought to her side by the men who had been supporting him. He had been rather badly mauled by one of the lions, but was now able to walk alone, though he was extremely weak from shock and loss of blood. "Pretty mess," what he remarked with a wry smile, indicating his bloody and disheveled state. "It is terrible," said the girl. "I hope you are not suffering." "Not as much as I should have expected," he replied, "but I feel as weak as a fool. What sort of creatures are these beggars, anyway?" "I don't know," she replied. "There is something terribly uncanny about their appearance." The man regarded one of their captors closely for a moment, and then, turning to the girl, asked, "Did you ever visit a madhouse?" She looked up at him in quick understanding and with a horrified expression in her eyes. "That's it," she cried. "They have all the earmarks," he said, whites of the eyes showing all around the irises, hair growing stiffly erect from the scalp and low down upon the forehead. Even their mannerisms and their carriage are those of maniacs. The girl shuddered. "Another thing about them," continued the Englishman, "that doesn't appear normal is that they are afraid of parrots and utterly fearless of lions." "Yes," said the girl, "and did you notice that the birds seem utterly fearless of them, really seem to hold them in contempt? Have you any idea what language they speak?" "No," said the man, "I have been trying to figure that out. It's not like any of the few native dialects of which I have any knowledge." "It doesn't sound at all like the native language," said the girl, "but there is something familiar about it. You know, every now and then I feel that I am just on the verge of understanding what they are saying, or at least that somewhere I have heard their tongue before, but final recognition always eludes me." I doubt if you ever heard their language spoken, said the man. These people must have lived in this out-of-the-way valley for ages, and even if they had retained the original language of their ancestors without change, which is doubtful, it must be some tongue that is no longer spoken in the outer world. At one point, where a stream of water crossed the trail, the party halted while the lions and the men drank. They motioned to their captives to drink too, and as Bertha Kircher and Smith Oldwick, lying prone upon the ground, drank from the clear, cool water of the rivulet, they were suddenly startled by the thunderous roar of a lion a short distance ahead of them. Instantly the lions with them set up a hideous response, moving restlessly to and fro, with their eyes always either turned in the direction from which the roar had come or toward their masters, against whom the tawny beasts slunk. The men loosened the sabers in their scabbards, the weapons that had aroused Smith Oldwick's curiosity as they had Tarzan's, and grasped their spears more firmly. Evidently there were lions, and while they evinced no fear of the beasts which accompanied them, it was quite evident that the voice of the newcomer had an entirely different effect upon them, although the men seemed less terrified than the lions. Neither, however, showed any indication of an inclination to flee. On the contrary, the entire party advanced along the trail in the direction of the menacing roars, and presently there appeared in the center of the path a black lion of gigantic proportions. To Smith Oldwick and the girl he appeared to be the same lion that they had encountered at the plain, and from which Tarzan had rescued them, but it was not Numa of the pit, although he resembled him closely. The black beast stood directly in the center of the trail, lashing his tail and growling menacingly at the advancing party. The men urged on their own beasts, who growled and whined but hesitated to charge. Evidently becoming impatient, and in full consciousness of his might, the intruder raised his tail stiffly erect and shot forward. Several of the defending lions made a half-hearted attempt to obstruct his passage, but they might as well have placed themselves in the path of an express train, as hurling them aside, the great beast leaped straight for one of the men. A dozen spears were launched at him, and a dozen sabers leapt from their scabbards, gleaming, razor-edged weapons they were, but for the instant rendered futile by the terrific speed of the charging beast. Two of the spears entering his body but served to further enrage him, as with demoniacal roars he sprang upon the hapless man he had singled out for his prey. Scarcely pausing in his charge, he seized the fellow by the shoulder and, turning quickly at right angles, leapt into the concealing foliage that flanked the trail, and was gone, bearing his victim with him. So quickly had the whole occurrence transpired that the formation of the little party was scarcely altered. There had been no opportunity for flight, even if it had been contemplated, and now that the lion was gone with his prey, the men made no move to pursue him. They paused only long enough to recall the 2 or 3 of their lions that had scattered, and then resumed the march along the trail. Might be an everyday occurrence from all the effect it has on them, remarked Smith Oldwick to the girl. Yes, she said. They seem to be neither surprised nor disconcerted, and evidently they are quite sure that the lion, having got what he came for, will not molest them further. I had thought, said the Englishman, that the lions of the Wamabo country were about the most ferocious in existence, but they are regular tabby cats by comparison with these big black fellows. Did you ever see anything more utterly fearless or more terribly irresistible than that charge? For a while, as they walked side by side, their thoughts and conversation centered upon this latest experience, until the trail emerging from the forest opened to their view a walled city and an area of cultivated land. Neither could suppress an exclamation of surprise. "Why, that wall is a regular engineering job," exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "And look at the domes and minarets of the city beyond," cried the girl. "There must be a civilized people beyond that wall. Possibly we are fortunate to have fallen into their hands." Smith Oldwick shrugged his shoulders. "I hope so," he said, "though I am not at all sure about people who travel about with lions and are afraid of parrots. There must be something wrong with them." The party followed the trail across the field to an arched gateway which opened at the summons of one of their captors, who beat upon the heavy wooden panels with his spear. Beyond, the gate opened into a narrow street which seemed but a continuation of the jungle trail leading from the forest. Buildings on either hand adjoined the wall and fronted the narrow, winding street which was only visible for a short distance ahead. The houses were practically all 2-storied structures, the upper stories flush with the street, while the walls of the first story were set back some 10 feet. A series of simple columns and arches supporting the front of the second story and forming an arcade on either side of the narrow thoroughfare. The pathway in the center of the street was unpaved, but the floors of the arcades were cut stone of various shapes and sizes, but all carefully fitted and laid without mortar. These floors gave evidence of great antiquity, there being a distinct depression down the center as though the stone had been worn away by the passage of countless sandaled feet during the ages that it had lain there. There were few people astir at this early hour, and these were of the same type as their captors. At first those whom they saw were only men, but as they went deeper into the city they came upon a few naked children playing in the soft dust of the roadway. Many they passed showed the greatest surprise and curiosity in the prisoners, and often made inquiries of the guards, which the two assumed must have been in relation to themselves, while others appeared not to notice them at all. "I wish we could understand their Bali language," exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "Yes," said the girl, "I would like to ask them what they are going to do with us." "That would be interesting," said the man. "I have been doing considerable wandering along that line myself." "I don't like the way their canine teeth are filed," said the girl. "It's too suggestive of some of the cannibals I have seen." "You don't really believe they are cannibals, do you?" asked the man. "You don't think white people are ever cannibals, do you?" "Are these people white?" asked the girl. "They're not Negroes, that's certain," rejoined the man. "Their skin is yellow, but yet it doesn't resemble the Chinese exactly, nor are any of their features Chinese." It was at this juncture that they caught their first glimpse of a native woman. She was similar in most respects to the men, though her stature was smaller and her figure more symmetrical. Her face was more repulsive than that of the men, possibly because of the fact that she was a woman, which rather accentuated the idiosyncrasies of eyes, pendulous lip, pointed tusks, and stiff, low-growing hair. The latter was longer than that of the men and much heavier. It hung about her shoulders and was confined by a colored bit of some lacy fabric. Her single garment appeared to be nothing more than a filmy scarf which was wound tightly around her body from below her naked breasts, being caught up some way at the bottom near her ankles. Bits of shiny metal resembling gold ornamented both the headdress and the skirt. Otherwise the woman was entirely without jewelry. Her bare arms were slender and shapely, and her hands and feet well proportioned and symmetrical. She came close to the party as they passed her, jabbering to the guards, who paid no attention to her. The prisoners had an opportunity to observe her closely as she followed at their side for a short distance. "The figure of a houri," remarked Smith Oldwick, "with the face of an imbecile." The street they followed was intersected at irregular intervals by crossroads which, as they glanced down them, proved to be equally as tortuous as that through which they were being conducted. The houses varied but little in design. Occasionally there were bits of color or some attempt at other architectural ornamentation. Through open windows and doors they could see that the walls of the houses were very thick, and that all apertures were quite small, as though the people had built against extreme heat, which they realized must have been necessary in this valley buried deep in an African desert. Ahead they occasionally caught glimpses of larger structures, and as they approached them, came upon what was evidently a part of the business section of the city. There were numerous small shops and bazaars interspersed among the residences, and over the doors of these were signs painted in characters strongly suggesting Greek origin, and yet it was not Greek, as both the Englishman and the girl knew. Smith Oldwick was by this time beginning to feel more acutely the pain of his wounds and the consequent weakness that was greatly aggravated by loss of blood. He staggered now occasionally, and the girl, seeing his plight, offered him her arm. "No," he expostulated, "you have passed through too much yourself to have any extra burden imposed upon you." But though he made a valiant effort to keep up with their captors, he occasionally lagged, and upon one such occasion the guards for the first time showed any disposition toward brutality. It was a big fellow who walked at Smith Oldwick's left. Several times he took hold of the Englishman's arm and pushed him forward, not ungently, but when the captive lagged again and again, the fellow suddenly, and certainly with no just provocation, flew into a perfect frenzy of rage. He leapt upon the wounded man, striking him viciously with his fists, and, bearing him to the ground, grasped his throat in his left hand, while with his right he drew his long, sharp saber. Screaming terribly, he waved the blade above his head. The others stopped and turned to look upon the encounter with no particular show of interest. It was as though one of the party had paused to readjust a sandal, and the others merely waited until he was ready to march on again. But if their captors were indifferent, Bertha Kircher was not. The close-set blazing eyes, the snarling fanged face, and the frightful screams filled her with horror, while the brutal and wanton attack upon the wounded man aroused within her the spirit of protection for the weak that is inherent in all women. Forgetful of everything other than that a weak and defenseless man was being brutally murdered before her eyes, the girl cast aside discretion and, rushing to Smith Oldwick's assistance, seized the uplifted sword arm of the shrieking creature upon the prostrate Englishman. Clinging desperately to the fellow, she surged backward with all her weight and strength, with the result that she overbalanced him and sent him sprawling to the pavement upon his back. In his efforts to save himself, he relaxed his grasp upon the grip of his saber, which had no sooner fallen to the ground than it was seized upon by the girl. Standing erect beside the prostrate form of the English officer Bertha Kircher, the razor-edged weapon grasped firmly in her hand faced their captors. She was a brave figure. Even her soiled and torn riding togs and disheveled hair detracted nothing from her appearance. The creature she had felled scrambled quickly to his feet, and in the instant his whole demeanor changed. From demoniacal rage he became suddenly convulsed with hysterical laughter, although it was a question in the girl's mind as to which was the more terrifying. His companions stood looking on with vacuous grins upon their countenances, while he from whom the girl had wrested the weapon leaped up and down shrieking with laughter. If Bertha Kircher had needed further evidence to assure her that they were in the hands of a mentally deranged people, the man's present actions would have been sufficient to convince her. The sudden uncontrolled rage, and now the equally uncontrolled and mirthless laughter, but emphasized the facial attributes of idiocy. Suddenly realizing how helpless she was in the event any one of the men should seek to overpower her, and moved by a sudden revulsion of feeling that brought on almost a nausea of disgust, the girl hurled the weapon upon the ground at the feet of the laughing maniac and, turning, kneeled beside the Englishman. "It was wonderful of you," he said, "but you shouldn't have done it. Don't antagonize them. I believe that they are all mad, and you know they say that one should always humor a madman." She shook her head. "I couldn't see him kill you," she said. A sudden light sprang to the man's eyes as he reached out a hand and grasped the girl's fingers. "Do you care little now?" he asked. "Can't you tell me that you do just a bit?" She did not withdraw her hand from his, but she shook her head sadly. "Please don't," she said. "I am sorry that I can only like you very much." The light died from his eyes and his fingers relaxed their grasp on hers. "Please forgive me," he murmured. "I intended waiting until we got out of this mess and you were safe among your own people. It must have been the shock or something like that, and seeing you defending me as you did. Anyway, I couldn't help it, and really it doesn't make much difference what I say now, does it?" "What do you mean?" she asked quickly. He shrugged and smiled ruefully. "I will never leave this city alive," he said. "I wouldn't mention it except that I realize that you must know it as well as I. I was pretty badly torn up by the lion, and this fellow here has about finished me. There might be some hope if we were among civilized people. But here with these frightful creatures, what care could we get even if they were friendly?" Bertha Kircher knew that he spoke the truth, and yet she could not bring herself to an admission that Smith Oldwick would die. She was very fond of him. In fact, her great regret was that she did not love him, but she knew that she did not. It seemed to her that it could be such an easy thing for any girl to love Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, an English officer and a gentleman, the scion of an old family and himself a man of ample means, young, good-looking and affable. What more could a girl ask for than to have such a man love her, and that she possessed Smith Oldwick's love there was no doubt in Bertha Kircher's mind. She sighed, and then, laying her hand impulsively on his forehead, she whispered, "Do not give up hope, though. Try to live for my sake, and for your sake I will try to love you." It was as though new life had suddenly been injected into the man's veins. His face lightened instantly, and with strength that he himself did not know he possessed, he rose slowly to his feet, albeit somewhat unsteadily. The girl helped him and supported him after he had arisen. For the moment they had been entirely unconscious of their surroundings, and now as she looked at their captors she saw that they had fallen again into their almost habitual manner of stolid indifference. And at a gesture from one of them the march was resumed as though no untoward incident had occurred. Bertha Kircher experienced a sudden reaction from the momentary exaltation of her recent promise to the Englishman. She knew that she had spoken more for him than for herself, but now that it was over she realized, as she had realized the moment before she had spoken, that it was unlikely she would ever care for him the way he wished. But what had she promised? Only that she would try to love him. And now she asked herself. She realized that there might be little hope of their ever returning to civilization. Even if these people should prove friendly and willing to let them depart in peace, how were they to find their way back to the coast? With Tarzan dead, as she fully believed him after having seen his body lying lifeless at the mouth of the cave when she had been dragged forth by her captor, there seemed no power at their command which could guide them safely. The two had scarcely mentioned the ape-man since their capture, for each realized fully what his loss meant to them. They had compared notes relative to those few exciting moments of the final attack and capture, and had found that they agreed perfectly upon all that had occurred. Smith Oldwick had even seen the lion leap upon Tarzan at the instant that the former was awakened by the roars of the charging beasts, and though the night had been dark, he had been able to see that the body of the savage ape-man had never moved from the instant that it had come down beneath the beast. And so if at other times within the past few weeks Bertha Kircher had felt that her situation was particularly hopeless, she was now ready to admit that hope was absolutely extinct. The streets were beginning to fill with the strange men and women of this strange city. Sometimes individuals would notice them and seem to take a great interest in them, and again others would pass with vacant stares, seemingly unconscious of their immediate surroundings and paying no attention whatsoever to the prisoners. Once they heard hideous screams up a side street, and looking they saw a man in the throes of a demoniacal outburst of rage, similar to that which they had witnessed in the recent attack upon Smith Oldwick. This creature was venting his insane rage upon a child which he repeatedly struck and bit, pausing only long enough to shriek at frequent intervals. Finally, just before they passed out of sight, the creature raised the limp body of the child high above his head and cast it down with all his strength upon the pavement, and then wheeling and screaming madly at the top of his lungs, he dashed headlong up the winding street. 2 women and several men had stood looking on at the cruel attack. They were at too great a distance for the Europeans to know whether their facial expressions portrayed pity or rage, but be that as it may, none offered to interfere. A few yards farther on, a hideous hag leaned from a second-story window where she laughed and gibbered and made horrid grimaces at all who passed her. Others went their ways apparently attending to whatever duties called them, as soberly as the inhabitants of any civilized community. God, muttered Smith Oldwick, what an awful place. The girl turned suddenly toward him. You still have your pistol? She asked him. Yes, he replied. I tucked it inside my shirt. They did not search me and it was too dark for them to see whether I carried any weapons or not, so I hid it in the hope that I might get through with it. She moved closer to him and took hold of his hand. Save 1 cartridge for me, please, she begged. Smith Oldwick looked down at her and blinked his eyes very rapidly. An unfamiliar and disconcerting moisture had come into them. He had realized, of course, how bad a plight was theirs, but somehow it had seemed to affect him, only it did not seem possible that anyone could harm this sweet and beautiful girl. And that she should have to be destroyed by him. It was too hideous, it was unbelievable, unthinkable. If he had been filled with apprehension before, he was doubly perturbed now. I don't believe I could do it, Bertha, he said. Not even to save me from something worse, she asked. He shook his head dismally. I could never do it, he replied. The street that they were following suddenly opened upon a wide avenue, and before them spread a broad and beautiful lagoon, the quiet surface of which mirrored the clear cerulean of the sky. Here the aspect of all their surroundings changed. The buildings were higher and much more pretentious in design and ornamentation. The street itself was paved in mosaics of barbaric but stunningly beautiful design. In the ornamentation of the buildings there was considerable color and a great deal of what appeared to be gold leaf. In all the decorations there was utilized in various ways the conventional figure of the parrot and, to a lesser extent, that of the lion and the monkey. Their captors led them along the pavement beside the lagoon for a short distance and then through an arched doorway into one of the buildings facing the avenue. Here, directly within the entrance, was a large room furnished with massive benches and tables, many of which were elaborately hand-carved with the figures of the inevitable parrot, the lion, or the monkey, the parrot always predominating. Behind one of the tables sat a man who differed in no way that the captives could discover from those who accompanied them. Before this person the party halted, and one of the men who had brought them made what seemed to be an oral report. Whether they were before a judge, a military officer, or a civil dignitary they could not know, but evidently he was a man of authority, for after listening to whatever recital was being made to him, the while he closely scrutinized the 2 captives, he made a single futile attempt to converse with them, and then issued some curt orders to him who had made the report. Almost immediately 2 of the men approached Bertha Kircher and signaled her to accompany them. Smith Oldwick started to follow her but was intercepted by one of their guards. The girl stopped then and turned back, at the same time looking at the man at the table and making signs with her hands, indicating as best she could that she wished Smith Oldwick to remain with her, but the fellow only shook his head negatively and motioned to the guards to remove her. The Englishman again attempted to follow but was restrained. He was too weak and helpless even to make an attempt to enforce his wishes. He thought of the pistol inside his shirt, and then of the futility of attempting to overcome an entire city with the few rounds of ammunition left to him. So far, with the single exception of the attack made upon him, they had no reason to believe that they might not receive fair treatment from their captors. And so he reasoned that it might be wiser to avoid antagonizing them until such a time as he became thoroughly convinced that their intentions were entirely hostile. He saw the girl led from the building, and just before she disappeared from his view, she turned and waved her hand to him. "Good luck," she cried, and was gone. The lions that had entered the building with the party had, during their examination by the man at the table, been driven from the apartment through a doorway behind him. Toward this same doorway, two of the men now led Smith Oldwick. He found himself in a long corridor from the sides of which other doorways opened, presumably into other apartments of the building. At the far end of the corridor he saw a heavy grating beyond which appeared an open courtyard. Into this courtyard the prisoner was conducted, and as he entered it with the two guards he found himself in an opening which was bounded by the inner walls of the building. It was in the nature of a garden in which a number of trees and flowering shrubs grew. Beneath several of the trees were benches, and there was a bench along the south wall. But what aroused his most immediate attention was the fact that the lions who had assisted in their capture and who had accompanied them upon the return to the city lay sprawled about upon the ground or wandered restlessly to and fro. Just inside the gate his guard halted. The two men exchanged a few words and then turned and re-entered the corridor. The Englishman was horror-stricken as the full realization of his terrible plight forced itself upon his tired brain. He turned and seized the grating in an attempt to open it and gain the safety of the corridor, but he found it securely locked against his every effort, and then he called aloud to the retreating figure of the men within. The only reply he received was a high-pitched, mirthless laugh, and then the two passed through the doorway at the far end of the corridor, and he was alone with the lions. Chapter 19. The Queen's Story. In the meantime, Bertha Kircher was conducted the length of the plaza toward the largest and most pretentious of the buildings surrounding it. This edifice covered the entire width of one end of the plaza. It was several stories in height, the main entrance being approached by a wide flight of stone steps, the bottom of which was guarded by enormous stone lions, while at the top there were two pedestals flanking the entrance and of the same height, upon each of which was the stone image of a large parrot. As the girl neared these latter images, she saw that the capital of each column was hewn into the semblance of a human skull upon which the parrots perched. Above the arched doorway and upon the walls of the building were the figures of other parrots, of lions, and of monkeys. Some of these were carved in bas-relief, others were delineated in mosaics, while still others appeared to have been painted upon the surface of the wall. The colorings of the last were apparently much subdued by age, with the result that the general effect was soft and beautiful. The sculpturing and mosaic work were both finely executed, giving evidence of a high degree of artistic skill. Unlike the first building into which she had been conducted, the entrance to which had been doorless, massive doors closed the entrance which she now approached. In the niches formed by the columns which supported the door's arch, and about the base of the pedestals of the stone parrots, as well as in various other places on the broad stairway, lolled some score of armed men. The tunics of these were all of a vivid yellow, and upon the breast and back of each was embroidered the figure of a parrot. As she was conducted up the stairway, one of these yellow-coated warriors approached and halted her guides at the top of the steps. Here they exchanged a few words, and while they were talking the girl noticed that he who had halted them, as well as those whom she could see of his companions, appeared to be, if possible, of a lower mentality than her original captors. Their coarse, bristling hair grew so low upon their foreheads as, in some instances, to almost join their eyebrows, while the irises were smaller, exposing more of the white of the eyeball. After a short parley, the man in charge of the doorway, for such he seemed to be, turned and struck upon one of the panels with the butt of his spear, at the same time calling to several of his companions, who rose and came forward at his command. Soon the great doors commenced slowly to swing creakingly open, and presently as they separated, the girl saw behind them the motive force which operated the massive doors, to each door a half-dozen naked Negroes. At the doorway her two guards were turned back and their places taken by a half-dozen of the yellow-coated soldiery. These conducted her through the doorway which the blacks, pulling upon heavy chains, closed behind them. And as the girl watched them, she noted with horror that the poor creatures were chained by the neck to the doors. Before her led a broad hallway in the center of which was a little pool of clear water. Here again in floor and walls was repeated in new and ever-changing combinations and designs, the parrots, the monkeys, and the lions, but now many of the figures were of what the girl was convinced must be gold. The walls of the corridor consisted of a series of open archways through which, upon either side, other spacious apartments were visible. The hallway was entirely unfurnished, but the rooms on either side contained benches and tables. Glimpses of some of the walls revealed the fact that they were covered with hangings of some colored fabric, while upon the floors were thick rugs of barbaric design and the skins of black lions and beautifully marked leopards. The room directly to the right of the entrance was filled with men wearing the yellow tunics of her new guard, while the walls were hung with numerous spears and sabers. At the far end of the corridor, a low flight of steps led to another closed doorway. Here the guard was again halted. One of the guards at this doorway, after receiving the report of one of those who accompanied her, passed through the door, leaving them standing outside. It was fully 15 minutes before he returned, when the guard was again changed and the girl conducted into the chamber beyond. Through 3 other chambers and past 3 more massive doors, at each of which her guard was changed, the girl was conducted before she was ushered into a comparatively small room, back and forth across the floor of which paced a man in a scarlet tunic, upon the front and back of which was embroidered an enormous parrot, and upon whose head was a barbaric headdress surmounted by a stuffed parrot. The walls of this room were entirely hidden by hangings upon which hundreds, even thousands of parrots were embroidered. Inlaid in the floor were golden parrots, while as thickly as they could be painted, upon the ceiling were brilliant-hued parrots with wings outspread as though in the act of flying. The man himself was larger of stature than any she had yet seen within the city. His parchment-like skin was wrinkled with age, and he was much fatter than any other of his kind that she had seen. His bared arms, however, gave evidence of great strength, and his gait was not that of an old man. His facial expression denoted almost utter imbecility, and he was quite the most repulsive creature that ever Bertha Kircher had looked upon. For several minutes after she was conducted into his presence, he appeared not to be aware that she was there, but continued his restless pacing to and fro. Suddenly, without the slightest warning, and while he was at the far end of the room from her with his back toward her, he wheeled and rushed madly at her. Involuntarily the girl shrank back, extending her open palms toward the frightful creature as though to hold him aloof, but a man upon either side of her, the 2 who had conducted her into the apartment, seized and held her. Although he rushed violently toward her, the man stopped without touching her. For a moment his horrid white-rimmed eyes glared searchingly into her face, immediately following which he burst into maniacal laughter. For 2 or 3 minutes the creature gave himself over to merriment, and then, stopping as suddenly as he had commenced to laugh, he fell to examining the prisoner. He felt of her hair, her skin, the texture of the garment she wore, and by means of signs made her understand she was to open her mouth. In the latter he seemed much interested, calling the attention of one of the guards to her canine teeth, and then baring his own sharp fangs for the prisoner to see. Presently he resumed pacing to and fro across the floor, and it was fully 15 minutes before he again noticed the prisoner, and then it was to issue a curt order to her guards, who immediately conducted her from the apartment. The guards now led the girl through a series of corridors and apartments to a narrow stone stairway which led to the floor above, finally stopping before a small door where stood a naked Negro armed with a spear. At a word from one of her guards, the Negro opened the door and the party passed into a low-ceiled apartment, the windows of which immediately caught the girl's attention through the fact that they were heavily barred. The room was furnished similarly to those that she had seen in other parts of the building, the same carved tables and benches, the rugs upon the floor, the decorations upon the walls, although in every respect it was simpler than anything she had seen on the floor below. In one corner was a low couch covered with a rug similar to those on the floor, except that it was of a lighter texture, and upon this sat a woman. As Bertha Kircher's eyes alighted upon the occupant of the room, the girl gave a little gasp of astonishment, for she recognized immediately that here was a creature more nearly of her own kind than any she had seen within the city's walls. An old woman it was who looked at her through faded blue eyes, sunken deep in a wrinkled and toothless face, but the eyes were those of a sane and intelligent creature, and the wrinkled face was the face of a white woman. At sight of the girl, the woman rose and came forward, her gait so feeble and unsteady that she was forced to support herself with a long staff which she grasped in both her hands. One of the guards spoke a few words to her, and then the men turned and left the apartment. The girl stood just within the door, waiting in silence for what might next befall her. The old woman crossed the room and stopped before her, raising her weak and watery eyes to the fresh young face of the newcomer. Then she scanned her from head to foot, and once again the old eyes returned to the girl's face. Bertha Kircher, on her part, was not less frank in her survey of the little old woman. It was the latter who spoke first. In a thin, cracked voice she spoke, hesitatingly, falteringly, as though she were using unfamiliar words and speaking a strange tongue. "You are from the outer world?" she asked in English. "God grant that you may speak and understand this tongue." "English?" the girl exclaimed. "Yes, of course I speak English." "Thank God," cried the little old woman. "I did not know whether I myself might speak it so that another could understand. For 60 years I have spoken only their accursed gibberish. For 60 years I have not heard a word in my native language. Poor creature, poor creature," she mumbled. "What accursed misfortune threw you into their hands?" "You are an Englishwoman?" asked Bertha Kircher. "Did I understand you right, that you are an Englishwoman and have been here for 60 years? The old woman nodded her head affirmatively. "For 60 years I have never been outside of this palace. Come," she said, stretching forth a bony hand. "I am very old and cannot stand long. Come and sit with me on my couch." The girl took the proffered hand and assisted the old lady back to the opposite side of the room, and when she was seated the girl sat down beside her. Poor child," moaned the old woman. "Far better to have died than to have let them bring you here. At first I might have destroyed myself, but there was always the hope that someone would come who would take me away, but none ever comes. Tell me how they got you." Very briefly the girl narrated the principal incidents which led up to her capture by some of the creatures of the city. "Then there is a man with you in the city?" asked the old woman. "Yes," said the girl, "but I do not know where he is, nor what are their intentions in regard to him. In fact, I do not know what their intentions toward me are." "No one might even guess," said the old woman. "They do not know themselves from one minute to the next what their intentions are, but I think you can rest assured, my poor child, that you will never see your friend again." "But they haven't slain you," the girl reminded her, "and you have been their prisoner, you say, for 60 years. "No," replied her companion, "they have not killed me, nor will they kill you, though God knows before you have lived long in this horrible place you will beg them to kill you." "Who are they?" asked Bertha Kircher. "What kind of people? They differ from any that I ever have seen. And tell me too how you came here." "It was long ago," said the old woman, rocking back and forth on the couch. "It was long ago. Oh, how long it was. I was only 20 then. Think of it, child. Look at me. I have no mirror other than my bath. I cannot see what I look like, for my eyes are old, but with my fingers I can feel my old and wrinkled face, my sunken eyes, and these flabby lips drawn in over toothless gums. I am old and bent and hideous, but then I was young and they said that I was beautiful. No, I will not be a hypocrite, I was beautiful. My glass told me that. My father was a missionary in the interior, and one day there came a band of Arabian slave raiders. They took the men and women of the little native village where my father labored, and they took me, too. They did not know much about our part of the country, so they were compelled to rely upon the men of our village whom they had captured to guide them. They told me that they never before had been so far south, and that they had heard there was a country rich in ivory and slaves west of us. They wanted to go there, and from there they would take us north, where I was to be sold into the harem of some black sultan. They often discussed the price I would bring, and that price might not lessen. They guarded me jealously from one another, so the journeys were made as little fatiguing for me as possible. I was given the best food at their command, and I was not harmed. But after a short time, when we had reached the confines of the country with which the men of our village were familiar and had entered upon a desolate and arid desert waste, the Arabs realized at last that we were lost, but they still kept on, ever toward the west, crossing hideous gorges and marching across the face of a burning land beneath the pitiless sun. The poor slaves they had captured were of course compelled to carry all the camp equipage and loot, and thus heavily burdened, half-starved, and without water, they soon commenced to die like flies. We had not been in the desert land long before the Arabs were forced to kill their horses for food, and when we reached the first gorge, across which it would have been impossible to transport the animals, the balance of them were slaughtered and the meat loaded upon the poor staggering blacks who still survived. Thus we continued for 2 more days, and now all but a handful of blacks were dead, and the Arabs themselves had commenced to succumb to hunger and thirst in the intense heat of the desert, as far as the eye could reach back toward the land of plenty from whence we had come. Our route was marked by circling vultures in the sky and by the bodies of the dead who lay down in the trackless waste for the last time. The ivory had been abandoned tusk by tusk as the blacks gave out. And along the trail of death was strewn the camp equipage and the horse trappings of 100 men. For some reason the Arab chief favored me to the last, possibly with the idea that of all his other treasures I could be most easily transported, for I was young and strong, and after the horses were killed I had walked and kept up with the best of the men. We English, are great walkers, while these Arabians had never walked since they were old enough to ride a horse. I cannot tell you how much longer we kept on, but at last, with our strength almost gone, a handful of us reached the bottom of a deep gorge. To scale the opposite side was out of the question, and so we kept on down along the sands of what must have been the bed of an ancient river, until finally we came to a point where we looked out upon what appeared to be a beautiful valley in which we felt assured that we would find game in plenty. By then there were only 2 of us left, the chief and myself. I do not need to tell you what the valley was, for you found it in much the same way as I did. So quickly were we captured that it seemed they must have been waiting for us, and I learned later that such was the case, just as they were waiting for you. As you came through the forest you must have seen the monkeys and parrots, and since you have entered the palace, how constantly these animals and the lions are used in the decorations. At home we were all familiar with talking parrots who repeated the things that they were taught to say. But these parrots are different in that they all talk in the same language that the people of the city use, and they say that the monkeys talk to the parrots, and the parrots fly to the city and tell the people what the monkeys say. And although it is hard to believe, I have learned that this is so, for I have lived here among them for 60 years in the palace of their king. They brought me as they brought you directly to the palace. The Arabian chief was taken elsewhere. I never knew what became of him. Ago XXV was king then. I have seen many kings since that day. He was a terrible man, but then they are all terrible. What is the matter with them? Asked the girl. They are a race of maniacs, replied the old woman. Had you not guessed it? Among them are excellent craftsmen and good farmers, and a certain amount of law and order, such as it is. They reverence all birds, but the parrot is their chief deity. There is one who is held here in the palace in a very beautiful apartment. He is their god of gods. He is a very old bird, if what Ago told me when I came is true. He must be nearly 300 years old by now. Their religious rites are revolting in the extreme, and I believe that it may be the practice of these rites through ages that has brought the race to its present condition of imbecility. And yet, as I said, they are not without some redeeming qualities, if legend may be credited. Their forebears a little handful of men and women who came from somewhere out of the north and became lost in the wilderness of Central Africa, found here only a barren desert valley. To my own knowledge, rain seldom, if ever, falls here. And yet you have seen a great forest and luxuriant vegetation outside of the city as well as within. This miracle is accomplished by the utilization of natural springs which their ancestors developed, and upon which they have improved to such an extent that the entire valley receives an adequate amount of moisture at all times. Ago told me that many generations before his time the forest was irrigated by changing the course of the streams which carried the spring water to the city, but that when the trees had sent their roots down to the natural moisture of the soil and required no further irrigation, the course of the stream was changed and other trees were planted, and so the forest grew until today it covers almost the entire floor of the valley except for the open space where the city stands. I do not know that this is true. It may be that the forest has always been here, but it is one of their legends, and it is borne out by the fact that there is not sufficient rainfall here to support vegetation. They are peculiar people in many respects, not only in their form of worship and religious rites, but also in that they breed lions as other people breed cattle. You have seen how they use some of these lions, but the majority of them they fatten and eat. At first, I imagine, they ate lion meat as a part of their religious ceremony, but after many generations they came to crave it, so that now it is practically the only flesh they eat. They would, of course, rather die than eat the flesh of a bird, nor will they eat monkey's meat. While the herbivorous animals they raise only for milk, hides and flesh for the lions. Upon the south side of the city are the corrals and pastures where the herbivorous animals are raised. Boar, deer and antelope are used principally for the lions, while goats are kept for milk for the human inhabitants of the city. And you have lived here all these years, exclaimed the girl, without ever seeing one of your own kind. The old woman nodded affirmatively. For 60 years you have lived here, continued Bertha Kircher, and they have not harmed you." "I did not say they had not harmed me," said the old woman. "They did not kill me, that is all." What the girl hesitated, what she continued at last, was your position among them. "Pardon me," she added quickly, "I think I know, but I should like to hear from your own lips, for whatever your position was, mine will doubtless be the same." The old woman nodded. "Yes," she said, "doubtless, if they can keep you away from the women." "What do you mean?" asked the girl. "And for 60 years I have never been allowed near a woman. They would kill me, even now, if they could reach me. The men are frightful, God knows they are frightful. But heaven keep you from the women." "You mean," asked the girl, "that the men will not harm me?" "God 25 made me his queen," said the old woman. "But he had many other queens, nor were they all human. He was not murdered for 10 years after I came here. Then the next king took me, and so it has been always. I am the oldest queen now. Very few of their women live to a great age. Not only are they constantly liable to assassination, but, owing to their subnormal mentalities, they are subject to periods of depression during which they are very likely to destroy themselves." She turned suddenly and pointed to the barred windows. "You see this room?" she said, "with the black eunuch outside. Wherever you see these, you will know that there are women, for with very few exceptions, they are never allowed out of captivity. They are considered and really are more violent than the men." For several minutes the two sat in silence, and then the younger woman turned to the older. "Is there no way to escape?" she asked. The old woman pointed again to the barred windows and then to the door, saying, "And there is the armed eunuch. And if you should pass him, how could you reach the street? And if you reach the street, how could you pass through the city to the outer wall? And even if, by some miracle, you should gain the outer wall, and by another miracle you should be permitted to pass through the gate, could you ever hope to traverse the forest where the great black lions roam and feed upon men? No," she exclaimed, answering her own question. "There is no escape, for after one had escaped from the palace in the city, in the forest it would be but to invite death in the frightful desert land beyond. In 60 years you are the first to find this buried city. In 1,000 no denizen of this valley has ever left it, and within the memory of man, or even in their legends, none had found them prior to my coming other than a single warlike giant, the story of whom has been handed down from father to son. I think from the description that he must have been a Spaniard, a giant of a man in buckler and helmet, who fought his way through the terrible forest to the city gate, who fell upon those who were sent out to capture him and slew them with his mighty sword. And when he had eaten of the vegetables from the gardens and the fruit from the trees and drank of the water from stream, he turned about and fought his way back through the forest to the mouth of the gorge. But though he escaped the city and the forest, he did not escape the desert. For a legend runs that the king, fearful that he would bring others to attack them, sent a party after him to slay him. For 3 weeks they did not find him, for they went in the wrong direction. But at last they came upon his bones picked clean by the vultures, lying a day's march up the same gorge through which you and I entered the valley. I do not know," continued the old woman, "that this is true. It is just one of their many legends." "Yes," said the girl, "it is true. I am sure it is true, for I have seen the skeleton and the corroded armor of this great giant." At this juncture the door was thrown open without ceremony, and a negro entered bearing 2 flat vessels in which were several smaller ones. These he set down on one of the tables near the women, and without a word turned and left. With the entrance of the man with the vessels, a delightful odor of cooked food had aroused the realization in the girl's mind that she was very hungry, and at a word from the old woman she walked to the table to examine the viands. The larger vessels which contained the smaller ones were of pottery, while those within them were quite evidently of hammered gold. To her intense surprise, she found lying between the smaller vessels a spoon and a fork, which, while of quaint design, were quite as serviceable as any she had seen in more civilized communities. The tines of the fork were quite evidently of iron or steel, the girl did not know which, while the handle and the spoon were of the same material as the smaller vessels. There was a highly seasoned stew with meat and vegetables, a dish of fresh fruit, and a bowl of milk beside which was a little jug containing something which resembled marmalade. So ravenous was she that she did not even wait for her companion to reach the table, and as she ate she could have sworn that never before had she tasted more palatable food. The old woman came slowly and sat down on one of the benches opposite her. As she removed the smaller vessels from the larger and arranged them before her on the table, a crooked smile twisted her lips as she watched the younger woman eat. "Hunger is a great leveler," she said with a laugh. What do you mean? Asked the girl. I venture to say that a few weeks ago you would have been nauseated at the idea of eating cat. Cat, exclaimed the girl. Yes, said the old woman. What is the difference? A lion is a cat. You mean I am eating lion now? Yes, said the old woman, and as they prepare it, it is very palatable. You will grow very fond of it. Bertha Kircher smiled a trifle dubiously. I could not tell it, she said, from lamb or veal. No, said the woman, it tastes as good to me. But these lions are very carefully kept and very carefully fed, and their flesh is so seasoned and prepared that it might be anything so far as taste is concerned. And so Bertha Kircher broke her long fast upon strange fruits, lion meat, and goat's milk. Scarcely had she finished when again the door opened, and there entered a yellow-coated soldier. He spoke to the old woman. The king, she said, has commanded that you be prepared and brought to him. You are to share these apartments with me. The king knows that I am not like his other women. He never would have dared to put you with them. Herog XVI has occasional lucid intervals. You must have been brought to him during one of these. Like the rest of them, he thinks that he alone of all the community is sane, but more than once I have thought that the various men with whom I have come in contact here, including the kings themselves, looked upon me as at least less mad than the others. Yet how I have retained my senses all these years is beyond me. What do you mean by prepare? Asked Bertha Kircher. You said that the king had commanded I be prepared and brought to him. You will be bathed and furnished with a robe similar to that which I wear. Is there no escape? Asked the girl. Is there no way even in which I can kill myself? The woman handed her the fork. This is the only way, she said, and you will notice that the tines are very short and blunt. The girl shuddered, and the old woman laid a hand gently upon her shoulder. He may only look at you and send you away, she said. Go XXV sent for me once, tried to talk with me, discovered that I could not understand him, and that he could not understand me, ordered that I be taught the language of his people. And then apparently forgot me for a year. Sometimes I do not see the king for a long period. There was one king who ruled for 5 years whom I never saw. There is always hope, even I, whose very memory has doubtless been forgotten beyond these palace walls, still hope, though none knows better how futilely. The old woman led Bertha Kircher to an adjoining apartment, in the floor of which was a pool of water. Here the girl bathed, and afterward her companion brought her one of the clinging garments of the native women and adjusted it about her figure. The material of the robe was of a gauzy fabric which accentuated the rounded beauty of the girlish form. There, said the old woman as she gave a final pat to one of the folds of the garment, you are a queen indeed. The girl looked down at her naked breasts and but half-concealed limbs in horror. They are going to lead me into the presence of men in this half-nude condition, she exclaimed. The old woman smiled her crooked smile. It is nothing, she said. You will become accustomed to it, as did I, who was brought up in the home of a minister of the gospel, where it was considered little short of a crime for a woman to expose her stockinged ankle, by comparison with what you will doubtless see, and the things that you may be called upon to undergo. This is but a trifle. For what seemed hours to the distraught girl, she paced the floor of her apartment, awaiting the final summons to the presence of the mad king. Darkness had fallen, and the oil flares within the palace had been lighted long before 2 messengers appeared with instructions that Herog demanded her immediate presence, and that the old woman, whom they called Zanila, was to accompany her. The girl felt some slight relief when she discovered that she was to have at least one friend with her, however powerless to assist her the old woman might be. The messengers conducted the two to a small apartment on the floor below. Zanila explained that this was one of the anterooms off the main throne room, in which the king was accustomed to hold court with his entire retinue. A number of yellow-tunicked warriors sat about upon the benches within the room. For the most part their eyes were bent upon the floor, and their attitudes that of moody dejection. As the 2 women entered, several glanced indifferently at them, but for the most part no attention was paid to them. While they were waiting in the anteroom, there entered from another apartment a young man uniformed similarly to the others, with the exception that upon his head was a fillet of gold, in the front of which a single parrot feather rose erectly above his forehead. As he entered, the other soldiers in the room rose to their feet. That is Metak, one of the king's sons, Zanila whispered to the girl. The prince was crossing the room toward the audience chamber when his glance happened to fall upon Bertha Kircher. He halted in his tracks and stood looking at her for a full minute without speaking. The girl, embarrassed by his bold stare and her scant attire, flushed and dropping her gaze to the floor, turned away. Mitak suddenly commenced to tremble from head to foot, and then, without warning other than a loud, hoarse scream, he sprang forward and seized the girl in his arms. Instantly pandemonium ensued. The two messengers who had been charged with the duty of conducting the girl to the king's presence danced, shrieking about the prince, waving their arms and gesticulating wildly as though they would force him to relinquish her, the while they dared not lay hands upon royalty. The other guardsmen, as though suffering in sympathy the madness of their prince, ran forward screaming and brandishing their sabers. The girl fought to release herself from the horrid embrace of the maniac, but with his left arm about her he held her as easily as though she had been but a babe, while with his free hand he drew his saber and struck viciously at those nearest him. One of the messengers was the first to feel the keen edge of Metak's blade. With a single, fierce cut the prince drove through the fellow's collarbone and downward to the center of his chest. With a shrill shriek that rose above the screaming of the other guardsmen, the man dropped to the floor, and as the blood gushed from the frightful wound he struggled to rise once more to his feet, and then sank back again and died in a great pool of his own blood. In the meantime, Metak, still clinging desperately to the girl, had backed toward the opposite door. At the sight of the blood, two of the guardsmen, as though suddenly aroused to maniacal frenzy, dropped their sabers to the floor and fell upon each other with nails and teeth, while some sought to reach the prince and some to defend him. In a corner of the room sat one of the guardsmen, laughing uproariously, and just as Mitak succeeded in reaching the door and taking the girl through, she thought that she saw another of the men spring upon the corpse of the dead messenger and bury his teeth in its flesh. During the orgy of madness, Anila had kept closely at the girl's side, but at the door of the room Metak had seen her and, wheeling suddenly, cut viciously at her. Fortunately for Zanila, she was halfway through the door at the time, so that Metak's blade but dented itself upon the stone arch of the portal, and then Zanila, guided doubtless by the wisdom of 60 years of similar experiences, fled down the corridor as fast as her old and tottering legs would carry her. Metak, once outside the door, returned his saber to its scabbard and, lifting the girl bodily from the ground, carried her off in the opposite direction from that taken by Zanila. Chapter 20. Came Tarzan. Just before dark that evening, an almost exhausted flyer entered the headquarters of Colonel Capel of the 2nd Rhodesians and saluted. Well, Thompson asked the superior what luck. The others have all returned. Never saw a thing of Oldwick or his plane. I guess we shall have to give it up unless you were more successful. I was, replied the young officer. I found the plane. No, ejaculated Colonel Capel. Where was it? Any sign of Oldwick? It is in the rottenest hole in the ground you ever saw. Quite a bit inland. Narrow gorge. Saw the plane all right, but can't reach it. There was a regular devil of a lion wandering around it. I landed near the edge of the cliff and was going to climb down and take a look at the plane. But this fellow hung around for an hour or more and I finally had to give it up. Do you think the lions got Oldwick? Asked the colonel. I doubt it. Doubt it, replied Lieutenant Thompson, from the fact that there was no indication that the lion had fed anywhere about the plane. I arose after I found it was impossible to get down around the plane and reconnoitered up and down the gorge. Several miles to the south I found a small, wooded valley in the center of which, please don't think me crazy, sir, is a regular city streets, buildings, a central plaza with a lagoon, good-sized buildings with domes and minarets and all that sort of stuff. The elder officer looked at the younger compassionately. You're all wrought up, Thompson, he said. Go and take a good sleep. You have been on this job now for a long while and it must have gotten on your nerves. The young man shook his head a bit irritably. Pardon me, sir, he said, but I am telling you the truth. I am not mistaken. I circled over the place several times. It may be that Oldwick has found his way there or has been captured by these people. Were there people in the city? Asked the colonel. Yes, I saw them in the streets. Do you think cavalry could reach the valley? Asked the colonel. No, replied Thompson. The country is all cut up with these deep gorges. Even infantry would have a devil of a time of it, and there is absolutely no water that I could discover for at least a 2-day march. It was at this juncture that a big Vauxhall drew up in front of the headquarters of the 2nd Rhodesians, and a moment later General Smuts alighted and entered. Colonel Capel arose from his chair and saluted his superior, and the young lieutenant saluted and stood at attention. "I was passing," said the general, "and I thought I would stop for a chat. By the way, how is the search for Lieutenant Smith Oldwick progressing?" "I see Thompson here, and I believe he was one of those detailed to the search." "Yes," said Capel, "he was. He is the last to come in. He found the lieutenant's ship, and then he repeated what Lieutenant Thompson had reported to him." The general sat down at the table with Colonel Capel, and together the two officers, with the assistance of the flyer, marked the approximate location of the city which Thompson had reported he'd discovered. "It's a mighty rough country," remarked Smuts, "but we can't leave a stone unturned until we have exhausted every resource to find that boy. We will send out a small force. A small one will be more likely to succeed than a large one. About 1 company, Colonel, or say 2, with sufficient motor lorries for transport of rations and water. Put a good man in command and let him establish a base as far to the west as the motors can travel. You can leave 1 company there and send the other forward. I am inclined to believe you can establish your base within a day's march of the city, and if such is the case, the force you send ahead should have no trouble on the score of lack of water, as there certainly must be water in the valley where the city lies. Detail a couple of planes for reconnaissance and messenger service so that the base can keep in touch at all times with the advance party. When can your force move out?" "We can load the lorries tonight," replied Capel, "and march about 1 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Good," said the general. "Keep me advised," and returning the others' salutes, he departed. As Tarzan leaped for the vines, he realized that the lion was close upon him and that his life depended upon the strength of the creepers clinging to the city walls, but to his intense relief he found the stems as large around as a man's arm, and the tendrils which had fastened themselves to the walls so firmly fixed that his weight upon the stem appeared to have no appreciable effect upon them. He heard Numa's baffled roar as the lion slipped downward, clawing futilely at the leafy creepers, and then with the agility of the apes who had reared him, Tarzan bounded nimbly aloft to the summit of the wall. A few feet below him was the flat roof of the adjoining building, and as he dropped to it, his back was toward the niche from which an embrasure looked out upon the gardens and the forest beyond, so that he did not see the figure crouching there in the dark shadow. But if he did not see, he was not long in ignorance of the fact that he was not alone, for scarcely had his feet touched the roof when a heavy body leaped upon him from behind and brawny arms encircled him about the waist. Taken at a disadvantage and lifted from his feet, the ape-man was for the time being helpless. Whatever the creature was that had seized him, it apparently had a well-defined purpose in mind, for it walked directly toward the edge of the roof, so that it was soon apparent to Tarzan that he was to be hurled to the pavement below, a most efficacious manner of disposing of an intruder. That he would be either maimed or killed the ape-man was confident, but he had no intention of permitting his assailant to carry out the plan. Tarzan's arms and legs were free, but he was in such a disadvantageous position that he could not use them to any good effect. His only hope lay in throwing the creature off its balance, and to this end Tarzan straightened his body and leaned as far back against his captor as he could, and then suddenly lunged forward. The result was as satisfactory as he could possibly have hoped. The great weight of the ape-man thrown suddenly out from an erect position caused the other also to lunge violently forward, with the result that to save himself he involuntarily released his grasp. Cat-like in his movements, the ape-man had no sooner touched the roof than he was upon his feet again, facing his adversary, a man almost as large as himself and armed with a saber which he now whipped from its scabbard. Tarzan, however, had no mind to allow the use of this formidable weapon, and so he dove for the other's legs beneath the vicious cut that was directed at him from the side, and as a football player tackles an opposing runner, Tarzan tackled his antagonist, carrying him backward several yards and throwing him heavily to the roof upon his back. No sooner had the man touched the roof than the ape-man was upon his chest. One brawny hand sought and found the sword wrist, and the other the throat of the yellow-tunicked guardsman. Until then the fellow had fought in silence, but just as Tarzan's fingers touched his throat he emitted a single piercing shriek that the brown fingers cut off almost instantly. The fellow struggled to escape the clutch of the naked creature upon his breast, but equally as well might he have fought to escape the talons of Numa, the lion. Gradually his struggles lessened, his pinpoint eyes popped from their sockets, rolling horribly upward, while from his foam-flecked lips his swollen tongue protruded. As his struggles ceased, Tarzan arose, and placing a foot upon the carcass of his kill, was upon the point of screaming forth his victory cry when the thought that the work before him required the utmost caution sealed his lips. Walking to the edge of the roof, he looked down into the narrow, winding street below. At intervals, apparently at each street intersection, An oil flare sputtered dimly from brackets set in the walls a trifle higher than a man's head. For the most part, the winding alleys were in dense shadow, and even in the immediate vicinity of the flares, the illumination was far from brilliant. In the restricted area of his vision, he could see that there were still a few of the strange inhabitants moving about the narrow thoroughfares. To prosecute his search for the young officer and the girl, he must be able to move about the city as freely as possible, but to pass beneath one of the corner flares, naked as he was except for a loincloth, and in every other respect markedly different from the inhabitants of the city, would be but to court almost immediate discovery. As these thoughts flashed through his mind and he cast about for some feasible plan of action, his eyes fell upon the corpse upon the roof near him, and immediately there occurred to him the possibility of disguising himself in the raiment of his conquered adversary. It required but a few moments for the ape-man to clothe himself in the tights, sandals, and parrot-emblazoned yellow tunic of the dead soldier. Around his waist he buckled the saber belt, but beneath the tunic he retained the hunting knife of his dead father. His other weapons he could not lightly discard, and so in the hope that he might eventually recover them, he carried them to the edge of the wall and dropped them among the foliage at its base. At the last moment he found it difficult to part with his rope, which with his knife was his most accustomed weapon, and one which he had used for the greatest length of time. He found that by removing the saber belt he could wind the rope about his waist beneath his tunic, and then replacing the belt still retain it entirely concealed from chance observation. At last, satisfactorily disguised, and with even his shock of black hair adding to the verisimilitude of his likeness to the natives of the city, he sought for some means of reaching the street below. While he might have risked a drop from the eaves of the roof, he feared to do so lest he attract the attention of passers-by and probable discovery. The roofs of the buildings varied in height, but as the ceilings were all low, he found that he could easily travel along the rooftops, and this he did for some little distance, until he suddenly discovered just ahead of him several figures reclining upon the roof of a nearby building. He had noticed openings in each roof, evidently giving ingress to the apartments below, and now, his advance cut off by those ahead of him, he decided to risk the chance of reaching the street through the interior of one of the buildings. Approaching one of the openings, he leaned over the black hole and listened for sounds of life in the apartment below. Neither his ears nor his nose registered evidence of the presence of any living creature in the immediate vicinity, and so without further hesitation the ape-man lowered his body through the aperture and was about to drop when his foot came in contact with the rung of a ladder, which he immediately took advantage of to descend to the floor of the room below. Here all was almost total darkness until his eyes became accustomed to the interior, the darkness of which was slightly alleviated by the reflected light from a distant street flare which shone intermittently through the narrow windows fronting the thoroughfare. Finally assured that the apartment was unoccupied, Tarzan sought for a stairway to the ground floor. This he found in a dark hallway upon which the room opened a flight of narrow stone steps leading downward toward the street. Chance favored him, so that he reached the shadows of the arcade without encountering any of the inmates of the house. Once on the street, he was not at a loss as to the direction in which he wished to go, for he had tracked the two Europeans practically to the gate, which he felt assured must have given them entry to the city. His keen sense of direction and location made it possible for him to judge with considerable accuracy the point within the city where he might hope to pick up the spoor of those whom he sought. The first need, however, was to discover a street paralleling the northern wall, along which he could make his way in the direction of the gate he had seen from the forest. Realizing that his greatest hope of success lay in the boldness of his operations, he moved off in the direction of the nearest street flare, without making any other attempt at concealment than keeping in the shadows of the arcade, which he judged would draw no particular attention to him in that he saw other pedestrians doing likewise. The few he passed gave him no heed, and he had almost reached the nearest intersection when he saw several men wearing yellow tunics identical to that which he had taken from his prisoner. They were coming directly toward him, and the ape-man saw that should he continue on, he would meet them directly at the intersection of the two streets in the full light of the flare. His first inclination was to go steadily on, for personally he had no objection to chancing a scrimmage with them, but a sudden recollection of the girl, possibly a helpless prisoner in the hands of these people, caused him to seek some other and less hazardous plan of action. He had almost emerged from the shadow of the arcade into the full light of the flare, and the approaching men were but a few yards from him when he suddenly kneeled and pretended to adjust the wrappings of his sandals, wrappings which, by the way, he was not at all sure that he had adjusted as their makers had intended them to be adjusted. He was still kneeling when the soldiers came abreast of him. Like the others he had passed, they paid no attention to him, and the moment they were behind him, he continued upon his way, turning to the right at the intersection of the two streets. The street he now took was at this point so extremely winding that, for the most part, it received no benefit from the flares at either corner, so that he was forced practically to grope his way in the dense shadows of the arcade. The street became a little straighter just before he reached the next flare, and as he came within sight of it, he saw silhouetted against a patch of light the figure of a lion. The beast was coming slowly down the street in Tarzan's direction. A woman crossed the way directly in front of it, and the lion paid no attention to her, nor she to the lion. An instant later, a little child ran after the woman, and so close did he run before the lion that the beast was forced to turn out of its way a step to avoid colliding with the little one. The ape-man grinned and crossed quickly to the opposite side of the street, for his delicate senses indicated that at this point the breeze stirring through the city streets and deflected by the opposite wall would now blow from the lion toward him as the beast passed. Whereas if he remained upon the side of the street upon which he had been walking when he discovered the carnivore, his scent would have been borne to the nostrils of the animal. And Tarzan was sufficiently jungle-wise to realize that while he might deceive the eyes of man and beast, he could not so easily disguise from the nostrils of one of the great cats that he was a creature of a different species from the inhabitants of the city, the only human beings, possibly, that Numa was familiar with. In him the cat would recognize a stranger, and therefore an enemy, and Tarzan had no desire to be delayed by an encounter with a savage lion. His ruse worked successfully, the lion passing him with not more than a side glance in his direction. He had proceeded for some little distance and had about reached a point where he judged he would find the street which led up from the city gate when, at an intersection of two streets, his nostrils caught the scent spoor of the girl. Out of a maze of other scent spores, the ape-man picked the familiar odor of the girl, and a second later that of Smith Oldwick. He had been forced to accomplish it, however, by bending very low at each street intersection in repeated attention to his sandal wrappings, bringing his nostrils as close to the pavement as possible. As he advanced along the street through which the two had been conducted earlier in the day, he noted, as had they, the change in the type of buildings as he passed from a residence district into that portion occupied by shops and bazaars. Here the number of flares was increased so that they appeared not only at street intersections but midway between as well, and there were many more people abroad. The shops were open and lighted, for with the setting of the sun the intense heat of the day had given place to a pleasant coolness. Here also the number of lions roaming loose through the thoroughfares increased, and also for the first time Tarzan noted the idiosyncrasies of the people. Once he was nearly upset by a naked man running rapidly through the street screaming at the top of his voice, and again he nearly stumbled over a woman who was making her way in the shadows of one of the arcades upon all fours. At first the ape-man thought she was hunting for something she had dropped, but as he drew to one side to watch her, he saw that she was doing nothing of the kind, that she had merely elected to walk upon her hands and knees, rather than erect upon her feet. In another block he saw two creatures struggling upon the roof of an adjacent building until finally one of them, wrenching himself free from the grasp of the other, gave his adversary a mighty push which hurled him to the pavement below, where he lay motionless upon the dusty road. For an instant a wild shriek re-echoed through the city from the lungs of the victor, and then, without an instant's hesitation, the fellow leaped headfirst to the street beside the body of his victim. A lion moved out from the dense shadows of a doorway and approached the two bloody and lifeless things before him. Tarzan wondered what effect the odor of blood would have upon the beast, and was surprised to see that the animal only sniffed at the corpses and the hot red blood, and then lay down beside the two dead men. He had passed the lion but a short distance when his attention was called to the figure of a man lowering himself laboriously from the roof of a building upon the east side of the thoroughfare. Tarzan's curiosity was aroused,